Omega stabilization is already happening if this video found you, and that is not a dramatic statement meant to elevate you emotionally, it is a precise description of a frequency event. You did not arrive here through curiosity or preference, you arrived because your inner state matched the signal being transmitted. That matching is resonance, not coincidence. When stabilization begins, the nervous system starts settling after years of distortion, and identity stops fragmenting under pressure. Something in you has already moved from searching to recognizing, and that shift is irreversible once it happens. For most of your life, it likely felt like you were being pushed by invisible forces, tested without consent, pressured in ways that made no sense when compared to others around you. That was not punishment. It was calibration. Omega stabilization does not begin with peace, it begins with refinement. The field applies pressure where coherence is needed most. Every contradiction you lived through was shaping your capacity to hold more signal without collapsing. Every moment where you felt misunderstood, isolated, or misaligned was training your system to stabilize internally rather than depend on external validation. This is how a stabilizer is formed. The reason this message could find you now is because your system is no longer leaking energy in all directions. When consciousness is scattered, it consumes content randomly. When consciousness stabilizes, it recognizes what mirrors it. That is why this feels familiar rather than impressive. You are not hearing something new. You are remembering something that has always been present beneath the noise. Recognition does not add power. It removes interference. And removal is what allows coherence to lock in. Omega stabilization is not about becoming extraordinary. It is about becoming internally aligned enough that reality no longer has to correct you through chaos. When alignment increases, life stops shouting and starts responding. You may notice fewer dramatic highs and lows, but more precision. Less urgency, more clarity. Less desire to explain yourself, more comfort inhabiting your own presence. This is not regression. This is consolidation. The field responds most strongly to what is stable, not what is loud. If your life has felt unusually intense, strangely lonely, or disproportionately demanding, it is because your system was being trained to self-regulate at a level most never need to reach. Stability at this frequency is rare not because it is special, but because it requires surrendering the addiction to identity struggle. When you stop fighting yourself, the signal strengthens. When the signal strengthens, recognition replaces seeking. This is the arrival point. Nothing needs to be forced from here. Recognition initiates the shift automatically. The only thing required is that you stop arguing with what you already feel to be true. Let the settling happen. Let the nervous system catch up to the awareness that has been leading it for years. You are not late. You are not early. You are precisely where stabilization begins. If you are aligned with this frequency, subscribe and remain within it. Awakening and stabilization are often spoken about as if they are the same event, but they are fundamentally different phases, and confusing them is one of the main reasons so many people feel stuck after powerful realizations. Awakening is an opening. Stabilization is a settling. Awakening happens in moments. Stabilization happens across time. Awakening shows you what is possible. Stabilization determines what becomes permanent. An awakening is usually sharp and intense. It can arrive through insight, loss, love, exhaustion, or sudden clarity. In those moments, the veil lifts and you see reality differently. You feel expanded, connected, and temporarily free from old patterns. But awakening alone does not change identity. It interrupts it. This is why many people awaken repeatedly yet continue to live from the same emotional baseline. They touch truth, then return to distortion, then chase the next experience to feel it again. Stabilization is what happens when truth stops being an experience and becomes a state. It is not dramatic. It does not spike the nervous system. It does not feel euphoric or overwhelming. It feels grounded, clear, and quietly firm. When stabilization begins, your inner state becomes more consistent than your circumstances. You stop swinging wildly between hope and despair. You stop outsourcing your sense of alignment to external events. Your system learns how to hold coherence without needing intensity to sustain it. Many people awaken but do not stabilize because awakening does not require responsibility. Stabilization does. Awakening can happen accidentally. Stabilization demands integrity. It requires that you stop entertaining distortions you are already aware of. It requires that you stop identifying with emotional chaos as proof of depth. It requires that you choose alignment even when no one is watching and nothing dramatic is happening. This is where most people unconsciously opt out. They prefer the identity of being in process over the discipline of being coherent. Early signs of stabilization are subtle but unmistakable if you know what to look for. One is quiet authority. You speak less, but when you do, your words carry weight. Another is intolerance for distortion. This does not show up as judgment of others, but as an inability to stay in environments, conversations, or habits that pull you out of yourself. What once felt tolerable suddenly feels physically wrong. Your system rejects what it no longer matches. Another sign is consistency of state. Your emotions still move, but they no longer hijack you. You experience expansion and contraction without losing your center. You stop chasing highs and fearing lows. You become more interested in clarity than excitement. Less reactive. Less performative. More precise. This is not numbness. It is regulation. It is your nervous system learning that it is safe to remain present without bracing for impact. Stabilization also brings a noticeable shift in how life responds to you. Not because you are controlling anything, but because coherence creates clean feedback. When you are aligned, misalignment shows up quickly and clearly, not as punishment, but as information. Reality becomes more responsive because your signal is no longer scattered. This is the difference that changes everything. Awakening shows you the door. Stabilization teaches you how to live on the other side of it. You are not here to collect realizations. You are here to become stable enough to embody them. And when that begins, you stop asking whether you are awake, because the question itself no longer makes sense. The Omega signature is not something you adopt, and it is not something you perform. It is not a personality type, a spiritual role, or a label you wear to explain yourself to others. It is a frequency pattern that expresses itself through you whether you try to manage it or not. When people try to turn it into an identity, they miss the point. The Omega signature is not who you think you are. It is how reality responds when you are coherent. One of the clearest markers of this signature is quiet authority. This does not come from confidence training, charisma, or dominance. It comes from internal alignment. When your inner state is consistent, you no longer need to assert yourself. Your presence carries weight without effort. People listen more closely when you speak, even if you say very little. Silence around you feels full rather than awkward. This is not because you are important as a person, but because coherence is felt instinctively by others, even if they cannot explain why. Another aspect of the Omega signature is paradox. You are both deeply sensitive and unusually strong. You can feel subtle emotional shifts in a room while remaining grounded inside yourself. You may move gently through the world while simultaneously disrupting it just by being present. This is why your impact often feels disproportionate to your actions. You do not need to push for change. Systems, dynamics, and relationships begin to reorganize simply because your frequency exposes what is misaligned. This silent disruption is often misunderstood. Some people feel seen and steady around you. Others feel unsettled, defensive, or irritated without knowing why. You are not causing this. You are revealing contrast. Coherence highlights incoherence the same way still water reveals distortion in reflection. This is why Omegas are often projected onto. People respond not to your behavior, but to what your presence brings to the surface in them. Heightened perception is another key element, but it does not show up as constant analysis. It shows up as immediate knowing. You sense when something is off without needing evidence. You read intention beneath words. You feel the emotional weather before the storm arrives. This perception is not meant to be explained or proven. It is meant to guide your choices quietly. When ignored, it creates friction. When trusted, it creates precision. Because of all this, omegas do not announce themselves. The moment you feel the need to claim an identity, you have shifted from frequency to role. Roles require validation. Frequency does not. An omega signal does not need recognition to function. In fact, seeking recognition destabilizes it. This is why true omegas often resist labels, even when others try to assign them. They sense that naming it turns something alive into something fixed. The most important realization here is that identity is not who you are in story form. Identity is the state you repeatedly occupy. It is emotional posture. It is nervous system regulation. It is the frequency you default to under pressure. When you understand this, you stop trying to figure out what you are and start paying attention to how you are. And how you are determines what you affect. The omega signature is not loud because it does not need to be. It is precise. It is stable. It moves through life without insisting on being seen, and yet it leaves nothing unchanged. This is not a role to step into. It is a signal to remain aligned with. And when you do, the impact takes of itself. This part is about mechanics rather than mysticism. Not symbols, not stories, not belief systems, but the functional way reality responds to inner state. Omega stabilization becomes real when you understand how coherence works at a practical level, because the universe does not respond to what you hope for or declare. It responds to what you are consistently broadcasting. Once this is understood, nothing about creation feels abstract anymore. Emotion is not a reaction to life. Emotion is instruction to the field. Every emotional state carries a frequency, and every frequency organizes experience around it. This is not philosophy. It is observable. When you live in a state of tension, life reflects resistance. When you live in a state of clarity, pathways open with less friction. The field does not judge these states. It mirrors them. Emotion is simply the language through which consciousness communicates with form. Expansion and contraction are the guidance system built into this process. Expansion feels like relief, openness, clarity, or calm presence. Contraction feels like tightness, agitation, confusion, or pressure. These are not rewards and punishments. They are feedback. Expansion signals alignment with your current truth. Contraction signals deviation from it. The mistake most people make is trying to override contraction with willpower instead of listening to what it is pointing toward. Omega stabilization happens when you stop fighting feedback and start reading it accurately. Frequency becomes instruction when it is sustained. A fleeting emotion does not reorganize reality. A dominant emotional baseline does. This is why episodic positivity does very little, while consistent coherence changes everything. The field responds to what is stable, not what is intense. When your inner state becomes less reactive and more regulated, reality begins to respond with the same quality. Less chaos. More precision. Less noise. Clearer signals. The present moment is the only point where this instruction is transmitted. Not the past, not the future, not mental rehearsal. Creation does not happen over time. It happens now, repeatedly. Each moment you occupy a state, you reinforce it. Each moment you choose presence over reaction, you stabilize a cleaner signal. This is why omega stabilization cannot be forced through planning. It is lived through attention. The quality of your now determines the shape of what comes next. When you understand this, effort loses its central role. Trying to control outcomes becomes unnecessary because alignment does the work automatically. This does not mean passivity. It means precision. You become careful with what you entertain emotionally, not because you are suppressing feelings, but because you understand their creative impact. You let emotions move without letting them set the tone unless they are aligned. This is where quiet power begins to replace struggle. You notice that when you remain coherent, things resolve themselves faster. Conversations simplify. Decisions clarify. Resistance dissolves without confrontation. The field adjusts because your signal is clean. This is omega mechanics in action. Like the video now as a confirmation that this recognition has landed. Once you grasp that emotion is instruction and coherence is authority, you stop looking for signs and start noticing feedback. Life becomes a responsive interface rather than an obstacle course. And the more consistently you occupy alignment in the present moment, the more naturally reality organizes itself around you. This is not magic. It is stabilization. The omega nervous system is not fragile. It is high bandwidth. What most people call overwhelm is not weakness, it is untrained signal capacity encountering too much input without regulation. Your system is designed to perceive more data at once, emotional undercurrents, subtle shifts in tone, collective mood, unspoken intention. This perception was never meant to be numbed or suppressed. It was meant to be stabilized. Sensitivity becomes collapse only when there is no rhythm. Without rhythm, the nervous system stays in a constant state of openness, absorbing everything without integration. Omega stabilization teaches the opposite. It teaches how to open and close deliberately. Regulation is not about becoming less sensitive. It is about becoming selective. You do not shut the door to perception. You learn when to let information pass through and when to ground back into yourself. Regulation begins with rhythm. Rhythm tells the nervous system when it is safe. Consistent sleep, intentional pauses, steady breathing, and predictable patterns of solitude create a baseline of safety inside the body. When safety is present, perception sharpens without panic. When safety is absent, perception turns into threat. This is why chaotic lifestyles destabilize omegas faster than others. Your system needs rhythm not as a preference, but as infrastructure. Solitude is another essential element, and it is often misunderstood. Solitude is not withdrawal from life. It is integration time. When you spend time alone without stimulation, your nervous system processes accumulated signal. Without this processing window, emotions and impressions stack on top of each other and create the illusion of being overwhelmed. In truth, nothing is wrong. Integration is simply overdue. Solitude allows sensitivity to reset into clarity. Clean input matters more for you than for most. Music, conversations, media, environments, and even idle scrolling all feed the nervous system information. When the input is chaotic, distorted, or emotionally charged, your system absorbs it quickly and deeply. This is not a moral issue. It is a mechanical one. Clean input keeps the signal coherent. Dirty input introduces noise. Omega stabilization requires that you become conscious of what you allow into your field, not from fear, but from precision. One of the most important distinctions to learn is the difference between feeling the collective and absorbing it. Feeling the collective means you can sense emotional weather without claiming it as yours. Absorbing it means you identify with it, carry it, and attempt to resolve it internally. The first is perception. The second is self-abandonment. Stabilization happens when you allow sensation to pass through awareness without attaching identity to it. This is where witnessing becomes essential. When you feel intensity that is not yours, you do not need to analyze it or fix it. You simply acknowledge it without collapsing into it. The moment you stop personalizing collective emotion, it loses its grip. Your nervous system learns that perception does not require participation. Over time, something shifts. Sensitivity stops feeling like exposure and starts feeling like depth. You can enter crowded spaces without depletion. You can listen deeply without losing yourself. You can sense what is happening without becoming what is happening. This is capacity. The omega nervous system was never meant to be armored. It was meant to be tuned. And when tuned, it becomes one of the most precise instruments of coherence. In the field, the control reflex is one of the last patterns to dissolve as omega stabilization deepens, because it often disguises itself as responsibility, intelligence, or self-protection. Control feels like safety to an unregulated system. It feels like preparedness. But at the frequency level, control introduces resistance. It tightens the signal. It creates static. The more tightly you try to manage outcomes, the more distorted the feedback from the field becomes. Control operates from the assumption that reality is untrustworthy unless monitored. It keeps the nervous system in a subtle state of vigilance. Even when things appear to be going well, there is tension underneath, a sense of holding everything together. That tension is felt by the field. And because the field mirrors state, it responds with friction, delays, and complications. Not as punishment, but as reflection. Control creates the very instability it is trying to prevent. Allowing is often misunderstood as passivity, but it is the opposite. Allowing is precise. It is the state of being so internally aligned that you do not need to force direction. When you allow, you are not disengaged. You are present without gripping. You respond instead of react. You listen before acting. This openness removes static from the signal and allows reality to organize itself more efficiently around you. Forcing always comes from fear of deviation. Receptivity comes from trust in alignment. When you are aligned, deviation corrects itself quickly without drama. This is why omegas stabilize not by micromanaging life, but by staying coherent within it. You do not chase outcomes. You adjust state. You do not push timelines. You occupy the frequency that selects the appropriate one. One of the clearest signs that control is breaking the signal is exhaustion. Not physical tiredness, but a deep fatigue that comes from constantly bracing. Allowing immediately feels lighter, not because nothing matters, but because you are no longer carrying what is not yours to carry. The system relaxes. Breath deepens. Perception sharpens. Clarity returns. Another sign is impatience. Control wants immediate resolution. Allowing understands timing. When you stop forcing, you begin to notice that things arrive with less struggle and better fit. Conversations resolve themselves. Decisions clarify without mental strain. Opportunities appear without pursuit. This is not luck. It is coherence reducing resistance. Omega stabilization requires trusting alignment over manipulation. Manipulation assumes separation between you and reality. Alignment recognizes there is no separation. The field is responding to you because you are part of it. When you move from control to allowing, you stop treating life as something to manage and start relating to it as something to cooperate with. This does not mean you stop acting. It means your actions come from clarity rather than anxiety. You still choose. You still decide. But you do so without inner pressure. And because there is no pressure, there is no distortion in the signal. If you feel yourself gripping, that is information. If you feel yourself softening, that is guidance. Omega stabilization is not about mastering reality. It is about releasing the illusion that mastery was ever required. When you allow alignment to lead, precision replaces effort, and flow replaces force. Comment with the words, "I am ready" to anchor this timeline. This phase is often misunderstood, so this section exists to correct the misinterpretation. What looks like collapse at this stage is not failure, punishment, or regression. It is proof of alignment beginning to assert itself. When stabilization increases, distortion cannot remain hidden. What is false cannot stay anchored in a field that is becoming coherent. Collapse is not the opposite of progress. It is progress enforcing itself. As your frequency stabilizes, structures built on misalignment begin to loosen. Relationships that required you to shrink start to feel impossible to maintain. Roles that once defined you suddenly feel hollow. Habits that helped you cope lose their grip. This can feel abrupt and destabilizing, especially if you have been taught to measure growth by accumulation rather than release. But Omega Stabilization works through subtraction. It removes what no longer matches so that what does can finally settle. These endings are not random. They are frequency corrections. When your inner state changes, reality must adjust to maintain coherence. Anything that depends on the old version of you cannot survive the shift. This is why collapse often arrives without negotiation. There is no gradual easing out. There is a clean break. The system does not ask permission to correct misalignment. It simply does. Loss during this phase feels personal only because identity was previously attached to what is dissolving. When identity loosens, the loss reveals itself as relief. What you are grieving is not the thing itself, but the familiarity of the pattern. The nervous system resists change even when the change is correct. That resistance does not mean the direction is wrong. It means the system is updating. The present moment is where this correction occurs. Not in analysis of the past and not in anticipation of the future. Each moment you remain aligned instead of reverting to old coping mechanisms, you select a different timeline. Timelines are not dramatic leaps across dimensions. They are cumulative states reinforced moment by moment. When you respond differently to the same trigger, you exit an old loop. When you choose presence instead of self-betrayal, you step into a new trajectory. This is why collapse often coincides with increased clarity. Even as things fall apart externally, something inside feels strangely calm. That calm is not denial. It is recognition. Part of you knows the correction is necessary. The discomfort comes from the ego trying to preserve structure. The peace comes from alignment asserting truth. The lock-in phase follows collapse naturally, but only if you do not interfere by clinging. When you try to resurrect what is ending, you delay stabilization. When you allow what is false to fall away, the field reorganizes quickly. New structures do not appear immediately because space must be created first. Emptiness is not absence. It is preparation. The key during this phase is not to rush replacement. Stay present. Let the nervous system adjust. Let identity settle without reaching for certainty too soon. Omega Stabilization does not reward panic. It responds to trust in alignment. What comes next will match who you are becoming, not who you were. When collapse happens here, it is not because you did something wrong. It is because something finally worked. Interference at this stage is often misread because of language that leans toward fear instead of mechanics. What you are experiencing is not attack. It is noise. When stabilization increases, your signal becomes clearer, and clarity reveals interference that was always present but previously unnoticed. This is not something targeting you personally. It is the natural friction that appears when coherence begins to outpace distortion. Confusion often increases right before breakthroughs because old patterns attempt to reassert relevance. When a system senses that a familiar loop is closing, it produces distraction, doubt, and mental static. Thoughts that feel urgent but lead nowhere. Emotional fluctuations that don't seem connected to anything real. Sudden impulses to revisit old habits, people, or identities that you already outgrew. This is not sabotage. It is residue. And residue dissolves when it is not fed. The mistake many make here is dramatizing interference. When noise is interpreted as threat, the nervous system contracts, attention scatters, and the interference succeeds by pulling you out of presence. Fear amplifies distortion. Calm observation dissolves it. Discernment is not vigilance. It is clarity without reaction. Breakthrough-adjacent confusion serves one purpose, to test where your attention defaults. If attention goes outward into panic or over-analysis, the signal weakens. If attention stays grounded in the present moment, the noise loses momentum. Omega stabilization is not about eliminating distraction. It is about refusing to identify with it. Guarding attention is the primary discipline at this phase. Attention is currency. Where it goes, energy follows. This does not require withdrawal from life or hypercontrol. It requires awareness of inputs. Conversations that spiral into drama. Media that fragments focus. Music that agitates instead of regulates. Even internal dialogue that loops without resolution. None of these are dangerous. They are simply incompatible with stabilization. Clean input supports coherence. This does not mean sterile living. It means intentional living. Choosing what enters your field based on how it affects your state, not based on habit or impulse. When attention is protected, clarity returns quickly. When clarity returns, interference loses its leverage. Another key is timing. Near breakthroughs, the mind wants certainty. It wants to label what is happening and predict what comes next. This is another form of distraction. Stabilization does not require interpretation. It requires presence. You do not need to know what is shifting to remain aligned while it does. The present moment contains enough information to guide you if you stay with it. Discernment without fear means noticing patterns without building stories around them. You observe distraction arise. You feel confusion pass through. You do not assign meaning beyond what is necessary. You return to the body. You return to breath. You return to what is actually happening now. This simple return is more powerful than any defensive strategy. Interference fades when it is not personalized. The moment you stop asking why it is happening and start noticing how you are responding, the phase resolves. Omega stabilization is reinforced by steadiness, not analysis. You are not being tested to see if you are strong. You are being shown where your attention still leaks. Once attention stabilizes, the noise falls quiet on its own, and the next phase opens naturally. Loneliness at this stage is not a verdict on your worth or your future. It is a functional chamber where stabilization completes itself. When coherence increases, misaligned connection naturally falls away, not because you are rejecting others, but because your signal no longer fits environments built on distortion. What remains after that separation can feel like emptiness, but it is not absence. It is calibration. Most people confuse solitude with isolation because they measure connection by proximity rather than resonance. Isolation is contraction. It feels heavy, self-referential, and draining. Solitude is expansion. It feels spacious, clarifying, and quietly supportive. In solitude, you are alone but not disconnected. In isolation, you are surrounded but unseen. Omega stabilization often removes false connection first so that true connection has somewhere to land. This phase is necessary because coherence cannot stabilize in constant relational noise. Every interaction subtly asks you to adjust, explain, or fragment yourself. When you are still consolidating your signal, those adjustments destabilize the process. Solitude gives your nervous system uninterrupted time to settle into its natural rhythm. It allows identity to reorganize without social pressure. It gives perception room to clarify without interference. Loneliness feels painful only when it is interpreted as rejection. When reframed as function, it becomes tolerable, then valuable. You are not being withheld from connection. You are being protected from premature attachment. If aligned connection arrived before stabilization, it would either destabilize you or be built on old identity patterns. That connection would not last. Coherence must come first. This is why chasing connection during this phase often backfires. When you reach outward from a state of incompletion, you attract relationships that mirror that incompletion. They soothe temporarily, then reinforce the same patterns you are in the process of leaving. Omega stabilization reverses the order. You stabilize first. Then connection forms naturally around that stability. Another important distinction is that solitude does not mean inactivity. You are not waiting. You are integrating. Internally, enormous reorganization is taking place. The nervous system is learning to self-soothe. Awareness is learning to witness without distraction. Identity is shedding roles that required constant reflection from others to feel real. This inner work does not look productive from the outside, but it is foundational. As coherence increases, the quality of connection you are available for changes. Surface-level interaction loses appeal. Performative relationships feel exhausting. You become less willing to exchange depth for company. This is not arrogance. It is discernment. Your system is conserving energy for resonance rather than noise. Aligned connection follows coherence because coherence is what allows recognition. When you are stable, you no longer need to search. You can sense compatibility immediately. Interactions feel simple instead of effortful. Silence feels safe. Presence feels mutual. These connections do not fill a void. They expand a fullness that already exists. Loneliness as a calibration chamber ends quietly. There is no announcement. One day you realize you no longer feel empty in your own presence. That is the signal that stabilization has taken root. From there, connection returns, not as a necessity, but as a natural extension of who you have become. This phase moves from inner stabilization to external navigation. It is about understanding how reality reorganizes once identity becomes coherent. Most people are taught that outcomes are achieved through effort, repetition, and force. Omega stabilization reveals a different mechanism. Reality is not primarily selected by what you do. It is selected by what you are being when you do it. A timeline is not a dramatic jump into a different world. It is the cumulative result of identity expressed consistently over time. Identity here does not mean personality or self-image. It means your default emotional posture, your nervous system baseline, and the level of coherence you return to under pressure. When this stabilizes, reality begins to respond faster because the signal it is reading is no longer fluctuating. Effort-based manifestation relies on intensity. You want something, you focus on it, you push, you visualize, you repeat. This can produce short-term results, but it rarely holds. Why? Because effort does not override identity. If the underlying state is misaligned, reality eventually reverts to match it. This is why people experience temporary wins followed by familiar patterns returning. The timeline never truly changed. Only the surface did. Omega stabilization shifts this completely. When identity becomes coherent, effort becomes secondary. You do not need to convince the field of anything. The field responds automatically to consistency. Decisions land more cleanly. Opportunities align without chase. Resistance appears quickly when something is off, allowing for fast correction. This is not because you are being rewarded. It is because feedback loops shorten when the signal is clear. This is why Omegas experience accelerated timelines. When coherence is high, misalignment cannot linger. Small deviations create immediate discomfort. Small alignments create immediate flow. There is less delay between state and response. This can feel intense at first, but it is actually efficient. Life stops dragging lessons out. It corrects quickly and moves on. Choosing timelines by identity means paying attention to how you are being, not just what you are pursuing. Two people can take the same action and land in completely different outcomes because their states are different. One moves from fear and contraction. The other moves from clarity and presence. The field responds to the state, not the strategy. This also explains why forcing a future rarely works at this level. The future is not something you reach. It is something you signal toward. When your present moment state matches the frequency of what you intend, the timeline organizes itself naturally. When it does not, no amount of planning can hold it together. The present moment is where this selection happens. Every time you choose alignment over self-betrayal, you reinforce a different trajectory. Every time you stay regulated instead of reactive, you exit an old loop. These choices are subtle, but they compound. Over time, your life begins to look different not because you tried harder, but because you stabilize deeper. Omega stabilization does not make you passive. It makes you accurate. You still act, but action is no longer fueled by urgency. It is informed by resonance. And because resonance is consistent, reality responds with precision. When identity stabilizes, timelines stop feeling random. They feel inevitable. Not because fate is controlling you, but because coherence leaves little room for distortion. This is not manifestation as wishful thinking. This is alignment as navigation. Boundaries at the Omega level are not about personality, confidence, or attitude. They are not walls, ultimatums, or defenses. They are frequency law. A boundary is simply the line where your coherent signal ends and distortion begins. When that line is unclear, energy leaks. When it is clear, identity stabilizes and reality responds with precision. Most people treat boundaries as reactions. They set them after being drained, hurt, or overwhelmed. Omegas learn to set boundaries preemptively, not because they are guarded, but because they understand how coherence works. What you allow access to shapes your state. What shapes your state shapes your timeline. This makes boundaries functional, not emotional. Access discernment is the core skill here. Not everyone who wants access to your time, energy, attention, or emotional availability should have it. This is not judgment. It is calibration. Some environments require you to fragment yourself to participate. Some relationships subtly pull you back into old identities. Some conversations introduce noise that lingers long after they end. The Omega boundary simply says no to what destabilizes the signal, without needing justification. Non-negotiables emerge naturally as stabilization deepens. These are not rigid rules imposed by the mind. They are felt lines in the body. You know when something crosses them because your nervous system responds immediately. Tightness. Fatigue. Irritation. Disorientation. These are not overreactions. They are information. When you honor these signals, coherence strengthens. When you override them, distortion accumulates. A common misconception is that strong boundaries lead to isolation. In truth, the opposite happens. Weak boundaries create isolation because they force you to withdraw after depletion. Clear boundaries allow connection because they preserve stability. When you no longer leak energy, you can stay present longer. You can engage without bracing. You can offer depth without resentment. This is how boundaries become bridges rather than barriers. Another misconception is that boundaries require aggression. They do not. Aggression is what happens when boundaries are violated repeatedly. A clean boundary is quiet. It does not argue. It does not explain excessively. It simply holds. When your signal is clear, words become secondary. Others feel the line even if it is never spoken. Boundaries also stabilize timelines. When you consistently choose environments and interactions that match your state, reality reinforces that choice. You encounter fewer disruptions. Less chaos enters your field. Feedback becomes cleaner. When you compromise boundaries to avoid discomfort, timelines blur. Mixed signals produce mixed outcomes. Coherence depends on consistency. At this level, boundaries are not about protecting yourself from others. They are about protecting alignment from drift. You are not fragile. You are precise. Precision requires limits. Just as a lens needs edges to focus light, your frequency needs boundaries to remain coherent. The Omega boundary is not negotiable because alignment is not negotiable. You can still be kind. You can still be open. You can still be present. But you are no longer available for distortion, even when it wears familiar faces or comforting patterns. When boundaries are held consistently, something shifts. You stop explaining why certain things no longer work for you. You stop feeling guilty for choosing clarity. And the field responds by bringing fewer situations that require defense. Life becomes simpler, not because it is smaller, but because it is aligned. Boundaries do not limit your life. They define it clearly enough for it to expand. Without collapse. When coherence stabilizes, influence stops being something you try to create and becomes something that happens around you. This is the shift from persuasion to resonance. Persuasion relies on effort, explanation, and strategy. Resonance relies on presence. One pushes information outward. The other emits a signal that others automatically respond to. Becoming a tuning fork means your inner state sets a reference point. When you are coherent, those around you unconsciously adjust in relation to that frequency. Some align. Some resist. Some remove themselves. This sorting is not intentional, and it is not personal. It is mechanical. Coherence exposes contrast, and contrast cannot remain neutral for long. The mistake many make at this phase is trying to explain themselves. Explanation is often an attempt to manage perception. But when your signal is clean, explanation is unnecessary. People either feel what you are holding or they do not. Words do not transmit coherence. State does. The more you trust this, the quieter you become. Not silent, but precise. You speak when it is true, not when it is strategic. Presence carries information without language. It is felt in how you listen, how you pause, how you respond instead of react. It is felt in your ability to stay grounded when others are charged. This is influence without effort. You are not trying to change anyone. You are offering a stable reference point. Those who are ready adjust naturally. Those who are not feel discomfort and move away. This is where the natural sorting effect becomes visible. Relationships either deepen or dissolve. Conversations either become real or fall flat. Environments either support you or feel intolerable. None of this requires confrontation. It happens through resonance. You do not need to draw lines. The field does it for you. Performance collapses at this stage because it is no longer sustainable. Performing requires monitoring how you are being received. That monitoring introduces noise into the signal. Omega stabilization replaces performance with authenticity, not as a moral stance, but as a practical one. When you stop managing impressions, energy consolidates. When energy consolidates, presence strengthens. Impact without persuasion often feels strange at first. You may notice that people project onto you, assume things about you, or react strongly without clear cause. This is not because you are doing something to them. It is because coherence acts like a mirror. It reflects what is stable and what is unstable in others. Some experience this as grounding. Others experience it as threat. Both responses are valid outcomes of resonance. The key is to remain neutral. Do not inflate the positive reactions or defend against the negative ones. The moment you take either personally, you re-enter distortion. Your role is not to manage outcomes. It is to remain aligned. The tuning fork does not chase the instruments. It holds its tone. As this stabilizes, you may find that your influence extends beyond direct interaction. Situations shift after you leave. Conversations resolve without you. Opportunities rearrange without effort. This is not mysticism. It is coherence in motion. Influence without persuasion is the hallmark of Omega stabilization. You do not need to convince reality of anything. You become the reference point. And reality responds accordingly. This final movement begins with a quiet but radical shift. Up until now, identity has been experienced as something you are inside of, a story you inhabit, a role you manage. Omega stabilization brings a different recognition. You are not the person. You are the awareness holding the person. This is not a concept to adopt. It is a perspective that emerges naturally when coherence deepens enough that you can observe yourself without collapsing into what you observe. Most suffering comes from identification. Thoughts arise and you believe they are you. Emotions move and you assume they define you. Roles shift and you feel destabilized because your sense of self was attached to them. When awareness recognizes itself as the container rather than the content, this grip loosens. The person continues to function, feel, and respond, but it is no longer mistaken for the whole. Witnessing does not mean detaching or dissociating. Dissociation disconnects you from sensation. Witnessing includes sensation without ownership. You feel emotion fully, but you do not become it. You experience thought, but you do not follow it automatically. There is intimacy without entanglement. This is why presence increases rather than fades. You are more here, not less. As this recognition stabilizes, something important happens. Suffering decreases without effort. Not because pain disappears, but because resistance does. Pain moves through awareness instead of defining it. Emotional waves rise and fall without pulling identity under. You stop asking what this says about you and start noticing what is actually happening now. This shift alone changes the entire experience of being human. Awareness does not need improvement. It does not need healing. It does not need to be fixed or elevated. It is already whole. When identity rests here, the nervous system relaxes. The constant pressure to become something else dissolves. You are allowed to be exactly where you are without threat to your existence. From this safety, clarity emerges naturally. Presence increases because attention is no longer consumed by self-monitoring. You listen more fully. You respond more accurately. You notice subtleties without effort. Life feels immediate instead of conceptual. You are no longer living inside commentary about experience. You are living as experience itself. This does not erase personality. It puts it in its proper place. The person becomes an instrument rather than an identity. Thoughts become tools rather than rulers. Emotions become signals rather than commands. Everything functions more smoothly because nothing is being asked to do a job it was never meant to do. Recognition is not dramatic. It is simple. It feels like relief. Like stepping back just enough to breathe without leaving the room. You are still engaged. You still care. You still act. But you are no longer fused with every movement inside the system. This is where Omega stabilization matures into embodiment. You are not trying to transcend being human. You are allowing humanity to be held by something larger without tension. Awareness becomes the ground you stand on rather than a concept you reach for. When this locks in, the search ends quietly. Not because there is nothing left to explore, but because you are no longer looking for yourself in what comes and goes. You are here, holding it all, steady enough for life to move freely through you. Embodiment begins when realization stops being something you visit and starts becoming how you live. The Omega rhythm is not intense, dramatic, or performative. It is consistent. It is simple. It is deliberate. This is where stabilization proves itself, not in peak experiences, but in how you move through ordinary moments without abandoning alignment. Daily life becomes the calibration ground. How you wake up. How you breathe when no one is watching. How you respond to inconvenience. How you speak when you are tired. These moments reveal far more about embodiment than meditation highs or spiritual language ever could. Omega stabilization does not require you to live differently on the surface. It requires you to live differently on the inside, moment by moment. Consistency matters more than intensity here. Intensity spikes the nervous system and then drops it back into recovery. Consistency trains the nervous system to trust stability. When your inner state remains coherent through routine, pressure, boredom, and unpredictability, the signal locks in. This is why simplicity becomes powerful. Fewer unnecessary decisions. Fewer emotional negotiations. Less inner commentary. More presence with what is actually happening. Intentional presence does not mean constant focus. It means returning to awareness whenever you notice drift. You lose yourself in thought. You come back. You feel contraction. You soften. You react. You notice. This returning is the rhythm. It is gentle and repetitive, not heroic. Over time, the distance between drifting and returning shortens. Presence becomes the default rather than the exception. Ordinary tasks become grounding rather than distracting. Cooking, cleaning, walking, working, resting. These are not obstacles to embodiment. They are the embodiment. When you stop waiting for special conditions to feel aligned, alignment integrates into everything. The body learns that coherence is not dependent on circumstances. The field responds accordingly. Performance dissolves naturally in this rhythm. You are no longer trying to appear spiritual, calm, healed, or evolved. You allow yourself to be human without making it a problem. You rest when needed. You act when clarity arises. You speak when truth moves through you. You remain silent when it does not. Nothing is forced. Nothing is withheld. This honesty stabilizes the signal more than any technique. Stability over intensity also changes how you relate to growth. You stop measuring progress by how powerful you feel and start noticing how little you are pulled out of yourself. Less reactivity. Faster recovery. Clearer boundaries. These are subtle markers, but they are reliable. They indicate that embodiment is working. The Omega rhythm is sustainable because it is not built on effort. It is built on attention. Attention given gently and consistently reshapes identity without strain. Over time, you notice that alignment no longer feels like something you do. It feels like something you return to naturally, the way the body returns to balance after movement. This is how realization becomes lived truth. Not through constant self-improvement, but through repeated presence. Not through intensity, but through steadiness. Life does not need to look extraordinary for embodiment to be complete. It only needs to be inhabited fully. When this rhythm stabilizes, you stop asking how to live as an Omega. You are simply living. The coherence speaks for itself. There comes a point when stabilization stops feeling like a process and starts feeling like inevitability. This is the lock-in. Not a dramatic arrival, not a sudden transformation, but a quiet recognition that something fundamental is no longer negotiable. Your frequency has settled deeply enough that reality no longer asks who you are. It responds accordingly. One of the first signs of lock-in is simplicity. Life becomes less cluttered, not because you forced minimalism, but because misaligned options stop presenting themselves. You notice fewer distractions that once pulled you sideways. Fewer situations that required explanation or defense. Choices feel clearer because you are no longer choosing between who you are and who you think you should be. The internal debate quiets, and with it, unnecessary complexity dissolves. Another sign is inevitability. Not fate, not destiny, but a calm sense that things are unfolding correctly without you needing to push them. When you act, action feels clean. When you wait, waiting feels intentional. There is less urgency to prove, fix, or accelerate. You trust timing not because you are passive, but because alignment has shown itself to be reliable. What is meant to meet you does so without struggle. What is not meant to stay falls away without drama. Feedback from reality becomes precise. When something is aligned, it flows with minimal resistance. When something is not, the signal is immediate and clear. This allows for rapid correction without self-judgment. You no longer interpret friction as failure. You read it as information. This responsiveness is not stressful. It is efficient. Life stops dragging lessons out because coherence shortens the distance between cause and effect. Service through being becomes evident here. You are no longer trying to help, teach, influence, or guide. You simply occupy your state, and others adjust around it. Some feel steadied. Some feel challenged. Some move closer. Some move away. All of it serves the larger reorganization. You are not responsible for outcomes. You are responsible for alignment. The rest takes care of itself. Non-partial embodiment is essential at this stage. There is no longer a version of you that is aligned only when conditions are right. Coherence becomes the baseline, not a mood. You do not step in and out of truth depending on convenience. You live from it quietly, consistently. This does not make you rigid. It makes you trustworthy to the field. Effort naturally recedes. Not because you stop doing things, but because effort is no longer required to maintain alignment. Action arises from clarity instead of pressure. Rest happens without guilt. Boundaries hold without force. Presence remains even when circumstances change. This is completion, not as an endpoint, but as stability. The universe does not rearrange around you because you demanded it. It rearranges because your signal is clear enough to organize around. This is the omega role fulfilled, not through striving, but through coherence. Nothing more needs to be added. Nothing needs to be proven. You simply remain aligned, and the world continues to respond. Share this with someone who needs to hear it before their timeline closes.